Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to introduce today's guest. We have Katherine Vandervort. She's an A and a former student of mine and is making her foray into the mental health field. Katherine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me.
Do you mind just starting us off with a quick introduction, who you are, tell me about your practice, and some of the areas of focus you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work with adult individuals and couples throughout the state of Washington and then at my practice in Kirkland. I'm really passionate about working with people who've experienced relational trauma. And I've realized throughout my work, there's a big intergenerational component to that transmission of trauma and keeping that trauma really alive for folks. I also work with couples who find themselves entangled in painful relational patterns. And then on a personal note, I myself am a second generation Korean American. And so it's been a really important point of curiosity for me, both personally and professionally, to look at that intersection of attachment wounding, relational trauma, and immigrant families.
And remind me the name of your private practice as well.
Yes. So my practice is Insightful Hearts Psychotherapy.
Is there a story behind that name? I just think it's such a thoughtful, intentional name.
Yeah, I love that question. So I practice primarily from a psychodynamic lens, also a relational lens, but a large part of my practice is around, okay, how do we grow your insight? How do we tap into the insight that you already hold for your life and for your relationships? Because I truly believe that each person is the expert of their lives, and my role is a facilitator to guide that journey.
I love that. I love when that orientation and the name, they have such a great relationship there. And I think that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, thanks. Thanks for asking.
Okay, so in your work, how have you observed that impact of intergenerational trauma, specifically on children of immigrants? And how does grief show up in that context?
I've heard you reference non-death losses a lot, disenfranchised grief, right? And there's so many non-death losses in this context. And I do want to caveat, I reference parent-child relations, but I know that caregiving and caretaking, that takes place through a lot of different forms for different families. There might be a multi-generational component where you're raised by your grandparents or your aunties. And for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to say parent or family. But yeah, within this context, really, I think for immigrants, there's really this double whammy where immigration itself can be quite a traumatic event, a traumatic process. You're pulled away from your community. You're uprooting your entire lives, sometimes coming to a country where you don't speak the language, you don't know the custom. And so you're without your support system in this entirely new area where you're focused on surviving. And not to mention, maybe you're coming from something in your home country that is traumatic. We don't really, as a society, talk a lot anymore about the Vietnam War or the Korean War or different things like that have taken place in other countries, but that is still a reality in the life history for immigrants.
Yeah.
And immigration itself can be traumatic. And then built on top of that is there's not really space or time for immigrants to process their trauma because they're so focused on survival. And you've got this double whammy here. So then as an immigrant, you're traumatized, you're oriented towards survival, and it's really important to make enough money and survive economically to feed your family, to house your family. And it could be less important to work with a trained professional, process that trauma. That's a less immediate concern. And yeah, so in a lot of the work that I do with my clients, I've had them tell me, my parents have never told me that they love me or that they're proud of me. right? In that orientation of survival, there's very little room for tenderness.
Yeah.
There's very little room for vulnerability, all things that we need really to develop.
Wow, such a powerful point. The tenderness piece, like you don't even think about that. When someone's in survival, when they're in that fight or flight, survive mode, you're not thinking about how do I be tender? How do I show empathy, compassion? How do I feel my feelings? Like you're trying to make it through. And then that's the headspace you're in raising a family. And so where's that space for the nurturing piece and that grief, that because we're coming from this context, this perspective of war and survival and trauma, that's going to ripple down through or compound on how I raise my family and have such a direct impact on it.
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. And there's so much grief, like grief around not feeling unconditionally loved, grief around your parents having gone through so much and you having watched that and actively participated in some of those hardships, grief around not receiving the same kind of tenderness that you see other kids in your class maybe receive from their parents.
Yeah. That's just such a powerful point to remember, especially when we even think about today's current political climate and the wars happening in the world and all of the ripples and the pain and that survival mentality from refugees and immigrants like that. I think that's just, it needs more space to talk about. And you're making space for that for your clients. I think that's huge.
Thank you.
So with even just starting to unpack the emotional complications there and that impact, like owning the intergenerational trauma, I would imagine there's feelings like I'm betraying my parents by trying to unpack that. Can you shed some light on some of the emotional complexities there?
Yeah, that's such a multifaceted, complicated dynamic that you're bringing up because, yes, acknowledging and owning your intergenerational trauma can absolutely feel like a betrayal to your parents, to your family system, especially if your parents or your family don't see eye to eye with the nature of that intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
But even when they do admit their shortcomings, because as a child of an immigrant, you're aware of all of the challenges your parents have gone through, right? And they might have even said, hey, we've sacrificed so much because we want to create a better life for you. And so that's just so much pressure there to appreciate what they've done for you. And given the circumstances, right, a lot of our parents did the very best that they could in those moments. And so you might feel protective of your parents because they've endured so much already. You may have seen them experience things like racism, classism, isolation from community, poverty. So you don't want to pile on to that. And so often, second generation immigrants are left feeling like they have to maintain the family status quo out of loyalty
Yeah.
and to protect their parents. And so this can lead into them not allowing themselves to set healthy boundaries and to express their emotions towards their family. But it comes at a huge cost. I notice a lot of my second generation clients have a lot of anger towards their parents, but then a lot of guilt and shame that they feel about that. And so those are really difficult emotions, intense emotions to sit with. A lot of folks don't know, how do you reconcile all of this within themselves?
And I hear, how do I hold space for more than one feeling? Like it's that, yes, I'm grateful for all they did, and yet I'm yearning and longing for empathy, connection, tenderness, and also I'm mad. I have anger that, yes, you got us out, you provided, and I wanted you to show up for me in a way that you didn't know how because you're in survival mode. And I get that doesn't feel fair, and yet I still really, I needed that as a human. And so that, yeah, so that just feels so complicated and so much grief because all of that is impacting past relationships and probably even present and future relationships and how we know how to show up in relationships because that's what was modeled.
Right. I think, yes, all of that. I think you've captured it so beautifully, the tension and just that tension there.
Yeah. So then a lot of the work you do is helping your clients probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, like is learning how to hold all of those things at once. And that, yeah, we got to tease them out. And then how do we hold them all together? It's like a giant knotted ball of yarn, and there's 8 different colors intermixed in there. And it's, I want to make a scarf, but I have to untangle all of these threads of yarn, and they're all these different feelings. And I got to figure out how to make them work together. How are they going to flow together? How do I use them all at once? Does that fit?
Yes, yes. I think that's such a brilliant way of putting that. Complicated, hard, beautiful process. Like unbraiding. Yeah, like that ball of yarn is a great metaphor. Like you're really unbraiding. What are the pieces of me that come from trauma? Like what's my life story versus what is my parents' life story? What's my guilt and shame versus what's their guilt and shame? What's my grief versus what's their grief that they haven't even allowed themselves to grieve?
And so how do I take care of myself in that way, knowing that I can't make my parents open that box for themselves, start to unbraid their own ball of yarn. And yeah, yes. Oh, and so
Yeah.
feeling like stuck, like I want to move forward with what I need, and yet I want to still be honoring to what they did and what they sacrificed and who they are. And then there's this cognitive dissonance for like, how do I do that?
Yes. And then I think there's also that piece of if my parents don't do it, then who am I? Can I begin to process and acknowledge my grief? Because I think often there's this game of comparisons that we play with grief and trauma.
Oh,
My parents had it so much worse. If they're not going to therapy and grieving over what they've gone through, what do I have as a second generation to do the same thing? And I really try to work with my clients to decouple that assumption that they're not allowed to process their grief if their parents haven't, because that's not true. We have our own grief journeys. And oh gosh, I'm forgetting where the quote was from, but I heard a really amazing quote. The first part of it was, no one needs you to dysregulate your body in solidarity,
oof.
right?
Can you say that again?
No one needs you to dysregulate your body in solidarity.
Wow. Ooh, I'm like tearing up at that. That's
Ugh,
so powerful. And I think, I mean, that speaks to almost like trauma bonding. And with this vein of intergenerational trauma, like you said, if my parents don't do this, then how is that going to make me too different that I can't connect with them? So I have to stay in that dysregulated space. I even remember working with a client, and it was like every time he went back to his childhood home, it was like he was re-entering 13-year-old body, and just all of that trauma from his own parents, and they were immigrants as well, and just getting him back in that headspace where he didn't feel like he could take care of himself, where he was allowed to be healthy, because that would be betraying his family of origin. And oh,
yeah.
so how do you use that lens then with your clients when there's acknowledgement, awareness that like, yes, parents were in survival mode, and yet I want to heal. And so we can use that lens that I don't have to dysregulate in solidarity, and yet there's still going to be barriers there. So what does that look like? How are some of those barriers show up?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And I think as you're doing this work, if your parents are at a different place in their journey, that's okay. It's important to remember that your story deserves to be heard and that your grief is real. It's so real, right? Just as your parents deserve their grief to be heard too. But like you said earlier, we can't force that on anyone else
Yeah.
but ourselves. When it comes to barriers to grieving together, I've noticed that orientation to survival really keeps people feeling a lot of anxiety when they think about looking back at their trauma. There's this, I think that orientation to survival really keeps them wanting to move forward like a shark, just always moving forward, always looking to the future. And there is a lot of fear associated with, hey, can we talk about what happened to grandpa? Can we talk about what happened? And A lot of times parents will give you like, what do you mean? Let's talk about it. What do you mean? And so it can be really hard to grieve together when there's that resistance there.
Yeah. I think so often in today's culture, there's these trends about if my family's not going to be healthy, then I'm just going to cut them off.
Right.
Okay, so if I start therapy as a second generational immigrant, how do you see that trend showing up in a different way? Or how are you helping normalize that it's okay to stay in relationship, and that just because I start therapy, that doesn't mean I have to cut a family member off, even though there's this preconceived notion that, well, if I need to get healthy, then that's what I need to do. So I guess I'm curious how that shows up in work with your clients, or if it does.
Yeah, absolutely. It totally does. I think, and it's different for everybody. So, what one person wants to do with their relationship with their family might not be the right thing for you. And I think it's great that we're bringing this up and talking about, hey, like we hear this narrative of almost you're supposed to cut them off if they're not where you are at. If you're not able to talk about your therapy sessions with your parents and have them respond in a certain way, then cut them off. I think we talked about the either or, right? Like this like black and white thinking of I can't talk through my grief if my parents have not talked through their grief, right? I think this is another way that black and whiteness can show up of if I am talking through my grief and they're not talking through their grief, then we can't coexist together. And I find that it is so hard to hold multi-layered truths. It's so hard to hold the good with the bad.
Yeah.
And that's probably why it does feel easier to listen to someone talk about, hey, I made this decision and you should also do this decision, instead of like, how on earth do I hold so much pain, so much grief, but so much joy as well? Because there have been joyous things that you share with your family and strengths that you've received from them. Right. It took me a really long time, many years of therapy, to be able to acknowledge, wow, I have a lot of personal strengths that I've received from my parents. My mom is intensely resourceful and she's so good with numbers and business and such a great work ethic. And I'm really proud of her. And I've also learned that from her. And I'm really proud of that for myself. And it's taken me a while, but I feel like I don't have to disown my grief just because I'm owning my strengths. And in the same way, I think you can still grieve what's coming up for you when you're not able to connect with your parents, and you can still be able to share a meal with them.
I think it hits all the things, right? Like it's allowing so much space for complexity and uniqueness and validating that each lived experience is unique unto itself. Each relationship is unique and there's no one right way to do it. Which, I mean, that's the whole thing with grief. There's not one right way. It's unique per person, per relationship, per perception, per background. I just think that's very well put. Such a lovely way to say that.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we're going to take a quick break for a message from this episode's sponsor. Are you ready to explore your grief with a guide crafted by someone who truly understands? Introducing Authentically Unapologetic, a grief journal meticulously designed by Dr. Heather Taylor, licensed psychologist and grief specialist. Dr. Taylor combines years of expertise with personal insights to create a journal that offers more than just blank pages. It offers a path to understanding and healing. Through carefully crafted prompts, reflection questions, and self-discovery exercises, this journal supports your unique journey through loss. Authentically Unapologetic is your companion in honoring your emotions and your person with genuine care and unapologetic authenticity. Available now on Amazon or at www.griefisthenewnormal.com. Start your journey of healing and self-discovery today. Thank you. It often falls on the children of future generations to grieve not only their own stories, but also their parents' stories. What are some of the challenges when it comes to grieving across generations?
That's a really great question. Like, specifically for immigrants, I think there's, on a broader level, like, we as a society, we really hesitate to talk about some of those traumas that have happened historically in other countries, but also within our country, right? I don't remember in high school learning that much about the Japanese American incarcerations in World War II.
Yeah.
And yet that had such a huge impact on Japanese Americans. And at that broader level, we're not used to really talking about those things. It's uncomfortable. But then I think also within the immigrant family, culturally, you might choose not to talk about trauma. And then, like I said, as part of that survival mentality, you might feel really anxious when you think about not continuously moving forward and pausing and looking back. Or I've also seen there can be this almost like comparison game of the first generation says they've had it so much worse. And so it becomes a point of disconnect and shame rather than an opportunity to grieve together across generations.
Yeah, that's so interesting. We talk about on the podcast grief occurring on a spectrum, and there's the instrumental end, which is very stoic presentation, internalized. We don't really talk about our grief. And the other end is more of the intuitive, emotive type grieving. Do you see that type spectrum playing out in how first and second gens are grieving? Like the talkers versus the non-talkers, the emoters versus the non-emoters.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm not, it could be a lot of things, right? I'm not quite sure if there's one particular reason for it, but yes, there's this almost a stereotypical image I hold in my mind of the first generation immigrant who's really stoic. They'll work really hard day in, day out, but they won't talk about their feelings. And so that really aligns with that really stoic end of the spectrum of grieving. And then that really expressive, emotional end of that spectrum, I really see as like the second, third, fourth generation immigrants who've been in the States longer.
Yeah, and I love the image of a spectrum because both ends are grieving. It just looks different. So how do we integrate recognition that just because they're not voicing it in the same way doesn't mean they're not feeling it in the same way?
Yeah, I really love that point that it'll look different. Just because it doesn't look the same doesn't mean it's not happening.
Or does it mean they're not feeling it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think so often we get caught up in what grief should look like or what we think it should look like versus how it actually can show up in such a variety of ways, whether that's someone just has a lot of chronic health issues because they physically stop taking care of themselves. And so they have stomach aches and headaches and chronic physical pain. Whereas on the other end, it can be more of that emotive, crying all the time, wanting to talk about it, going to the graveside a lot, that kind of type grief. And so I think it's interesting when we apply that same spectrum to a non-death type loss, and how does that show up in conversations?
Yeah, and I get the picture of almost of the more emotive person being like, hey, can we talk about this? Let's talk about this. And then someone on the other end of the spectrum being like, what is there to talk about? That happened.
Yeah.
Okay, that happened 40 years ago.
So then your work is how do we find a middle ground, right? Because
Yes.
especially I would imagine in family therapy, like how do we make space for familial grief, for community grief, where there's space for all the generations to show up
Yeah.
in how it feels comfortable for them to grieve in their own unique ways.
Yeah. And I think when we have that conversation, it is really important to point out we all have our different ways of processing and of grieving, right? And just because someone is not outwardly emoting doesn't mean they're not in grief about it. And so, how do we tap into common ground? How do we have conversation that feels productive?
Yes. So, in a slightly different vein, thinking about these multidimensional aspects of story, of our own different generational truths, and you touched on this just a little bit gratitude for the strengths that you got from your parents. What does it look like to work with your clients to help them hold space for both the strengths and the pain of your family histories while finding ways to like honor and acknowledge grief?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's such a beautiful question. I think first and foremost, always keeping in mind, it's really important to remember that your grief deserves the space to be felt. Because I think, especially with second, third, fourth generation immigrants, it's really easy because that the MO has been in their family. Hey, if you have grief, you don't talk about it, okay? It's really important to really highlight and keep reminding my clients, no, your grief, your story deserves space, and let's talk about it. And it is important to remember that the grief that you feel is a reflection of the multifaceted truth of your story. And it's also multi-generational. Your grief contains your parents' grief, contains your grandparents' grief, contains their parents' grief.
Yeah.
Like, there are so many layers here. And so I always like to remind my clients, this is really hard work. This is really brave work. And it's just really hard work because you're grieving not only for yourself, but for the generations before you.
Yeah.
And so it's okay if it's slow going. It's okay if your grief changes as it does, right? Because it's alive and dynamic, just like you. You're going to feel different things come up as you go through therapy, right? Maybe you'll grieve things that you didn't expect to grieve. Like, I can't have a conversation like I'm having with my therapist with my parents.
Yeah.
Like, that's a new kind of grief.
Just like you said, it's finding those spaces to process what we need to process, even if the people we most want to talk to aren't able to engage in that conversation, because we need to be able to do our own work to feel like we can exist in our bodies, in the world, in our relationships. And we can grieve that those closest to us maybe aren't willing or able or understanding what it means to even process it because they're coming from a different context. And so, yes, like you can grieve that as your therapist, I'm the one that you're having these conversations with when really like you'd like to talk to your mom or your auntie or your grandparent. And they're either maybe not as safe or not capable of engaging in that dialogue in a way that you need. Yeah. And yet, like, you still are, you're entitled to ask about it, to talk about it, to say the uncomfortable things.
Yes. And I think a lot of families might be surprised because this isn't the regular MO, right? You're breaking this kind of family tradition of not talking about grief. And I would say be prepared for some surprise, be prepared for reactions, right? Because you've been doing all of this work and processing your grief, but they haven't. And to them, it's you're coming in and completely changing the game.
Yeah, you're changing the unwritten family rules, and
Yes.
that's uncomfortable.
Yes.
Yes. So, speaking of changing unwritten rules, and we've been talking about some really amazing concepts, but what are some practical strategies, right? So, what would you suggest are some strategies for individuals that are trying to process and grieve intergenerational trauma, especially because it can feel overwhelming and isolating?
Yes. Great question. I would say find people who you trust, who resonate with your story. Share your story, share your grief, so you're not grieving alone. I think it's really important to grieve with people, especially folks who maybe have gone through something similar, and really deeply and intimately understand your grief and your story. But I think it's also important to share your story with trusted people who are different from you. And that can be really scary. But I think it's almost another level of giving your story the space it deserves, the space that you've craved to receive. You're giving yourself that space. And then also, I think find stories that make you feel seen and not alone. I personally love memoirs, and Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. Such a great book. Absolute tearjerker. What My Bones Know is also another really amazing book. The author Stephanie, she talks about her CPTSD diagnosis as a child of an immigrant. And then if you're wanting more support around your grief journey, I think it's important to find a therapist who has a good understanding of generational trauma.
I think those are such helpful suggestions. Like, especially, I love the idea of finding stories that resonate with you. And so reading memoirs where there's going to be some overlap in those identifiers, right? Where maybe they're able to articulate something that I felt my whole life and yet haven't been able to articulate. And maybe I'll find that in a memoir in one of those books. As we start to wrap up, what would you say are, for someone just beginning to acknowledge and grieve the impact of their generational trauma, what are 2 or 3 takeaways you'd want them to know as they get started?
Yeah, I think firstly, it's okay to be angry at your family, at your parents, at the world. It is okay to acknowledge what you have lost, because you have lost. You've lost out on tenderness, you've lost out on moments of connection, etc. And then know that grief is not linear. You talk about this all the time, right? It's not the 5 stages of grief. It's different states that will change and evolve as your grief does. And just know that. And then know that you are doing such a brave and hard act of feeling your grief and breaking that family tradition. It can be really hard and it can be really lonely. And so don't do it alone. Find the people who will support you.
So often we feel vulnerable when we're grieving. And so when we're feeling vulnerable, I got to protect myself. I got to put my shields up. And yet
Totally.
with work like this, like with any kind of grief work, how do we invite people into that loss space, into that grief space with us that helps us feel stronger in figuring out what it means to grieve, and so that we don't have to do it alone?
Yeah, exactly. And it is so hard. It's still so hard for me when I'm in my grief to invite people into it. And it's also the thing that helps so much.
Yeah. And it's not something people have to fix. Like, it's listening to and validating my story and my feelings. Like, you don't need to change my past. I don't need a magic wand. There's no bibbity bobbity boo action happening. Like, I just need someone to show up in that space with me and be present with me.
Just be with me.
Yeah. Katherine, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I'm so blown away by your insights, and your clients are so lucky to get to work with you. And I'm just excited for the direction that your career is going to continue to grow and the people that you're going to support. I think you're going to do amazing things.
Thank you so much.
So if people are interested in connecting with you, either to learn more or to work with you, what is the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yes, you can find out about the services I offer at my website, insightfulhearts-psychotherapy.com. I also have future plans to facilitate group therapy for generational and relational trauma. And so if you're interested in something like that, please get in touch with me through my website.
Katherine, again, thank you so much for this great conversation. And listeners, remember to be kind to yourselves today, and we'll see you next time. That's all for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If today's conversation resonated with you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need it. And if you're looking for more support or resources, feel free to head over to The Morning Movement, where we continue to build community and normalize these hard, beautiful parts of life. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and until next time, be kind to yourself. Opening and closing music is provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, collaboration, or training opportunities, feel free to email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. And podcasts are also now available streaming on YouTube.